December 17, 1944. The northern edge of the Ardennes. Snow drifts through a gray dawn as German officers huddle around a field map. Their counteroffensive has just begun. The panzers have punched a hole through thin American lines and morale is high. But then the air trembles. A low, distant thunder rolls across the forest. The first American shells arrive not as scattered fire, but in one single synchronized roar. Within seconds, dozens of 150 centimeter rounds strike with mathematical precision, walking from one tree line to the next, each impact placed as if plotted by hand. Men dive for cover, shouting coordinates that no longer matter. The pattern doesn't falter. Every few seconds, another wave hits. German officers stare through binoculars, stunned. The Americans shouldn't know their position, and yet the shells are landing exactly where they stand. To them, it feels impossible. To the Americans, it's the product of science, discipline, and a weapon perfected by calculation. The story of how that precision was born begins long before the snow of 1944. To understand why those German officers were so shocked, the concept was led by the Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Laboratory, working closely with the U.S. Navy Bureau of Ordnance. It was classified as one of the most secret wartime projects after the atomic bomb and radar, known only to a handful of engineers under the code name VT, for variable time. By 1943, the first prototypes were ready. Inside each fuse was a miniature radio transmitter, receiver, and vacuum tube assembly, a technological miracle at the time. As the shell approached its target, it sent out radio waves. When those waves reflected back from a nearby object, the fuse sensed the change in frequency and triggered detonation at just the right height. That meant a 155mm shell could now explode in the air, directly above enemy troops or vehicles, showering them with lethal fragments over a wide radius. The first combat tests were carried out by the U.S. Navy in the Pacific, where the proximity fuse proved devastating against Japanese aircraft. Anti-aircraft gunners who once fired hundreds of shells for a single hit now needed only a few. The improvement was so dramatic that naval officers called it the closest thing to magic we ever saw. But the true transformation came when the technology reached the Army's field artillery. By late 1944, the U.S. Army Ordnance Department had adapted the fuse for ground use. Its arrival coincided with the massive buildup of Allied forces preparing for the final push into Germany. Thousands of 155mm long-tom guns were now being fitted with proximity fuses, and the effect would soon be seen and felt across Europe. German officers first reported strange explosions during the Battle of the Bulge. They described shells that burst in the air, just above their positions, even when they were hidden in forests or behind ridges. Soldiers thought the Americans had developed a new kind of radar-guided artillery, and in a sense they had. Captured reports from the German High Command revealed genuine confusion. One officer wrote that American artillery seems able to see through the forest canopy. Another near Bastogne noted that no movement remains unseen. Each shell finds its mark. Behind these results stood a perfect blend of science and discipline. Each battery had trained to coordinate data faster than ever. Wind, humidity, distance, and elevation were all factored into firing tables within minutes. The fire direction centers synchronized multiple batteries to strike simultaneously, each shell equipped with its own proximity fuse. When the rounds landed, they detonated before impact, maximizing the lethal radius, neutralizing cover, and wiping out advancing formations. This was the moment when German confidence in their own artillery began to falter. Their 105mm and 150mm howitzers were still powerful, but they couldn't match the precision or consistency of the Americans. Worse, Germany lacked the industrial capacity to mass-produce anything comparable. By winter 1944, the U.S. Army had fired over 1,150mm shells in Europe. With proximity fuses, the effectiveness of each round had increased several times over. It wasn't luck anymore. It was science, logistics, and sheer industrial power, the kind of advantage that could not be outfought. And soon, in the frozen forests of Belgium, the Germans would witness exactly how unstoppable that combination had become. Every great army in history has depended on tactics, but by 1944, American artillery had turned tactics into an exact science. The U.S. system of fire direction was unlike anything the Germans faced. Instead of a single commander shouting orders, American gunners worked through a structured chain. forward observers, plotting teams, and fire direction centers, FDCs. The FDC was the brain of the battery. Inside, men worked with rulers, protractors, and firing tables the size of blueprints. Each shell's trajectory was calculated down to the second. This wasn't guesswork. When an observer called in coordinates, the FDC converted those map readings into azimuth angles, elevation settings, and powder charges, adjusting for wind, humidity, and terrain. The data was passed instantly through radio networks linking every gun in the area. Then came the brilliance of time on target, TOT, one of the most feared American artillery tactics of the war. Gunners at different ranges fired at precisely calculated intervals so that every shell, no matter the distance, landed at the same moment on the target. The psychological effect was enormous. German soldiers described it as being swallowed by the sky. There was no warning whistle, no gradual buildup, just a single deafening eruption that flattened entire positions in seconds. This level of timing demanded immense discipline. A single mistake in calculation could throw off the entire barrage. The proximity fuse transformed the character of American firepower. A standard artillery shell, even when fired perfectly, still depended on physical impact. That meant trees, snow, or uneven ground could absorb much of the blast. The proximity fuse eliminated that weakness. Once the fuse detected it was within a few meters of a target or the ground, it triggered detonation, creating an airburst that spread fragments evenly in all directions. The result was catastrophic to troops caught in the open or even in shallow cover. German soldiers soon learned that traditional foxholes and camouflage no longer offered protection. The shells seemed to search for them, exploding just overhead and raining steel fragments at deadly velocity. American reports showed that proximity-fused shells were 5 to 10 times more effective than impact-fused rounds in open terrain. Infantry units under fire described enemy positions being lifted off the earth. Behind that effect lay one of the most complex manufacturing efforts of the entire war. Each fuse required miniature vacuum tubes, hand-assembled under extreme precision. The components had to survive the enormous acceleration of being fired from a gun, nearly 20,000 times the force of gravity. To ensure secrecy, the proximity fuse was classified as restricted highest. Soldiers were warned not to let unexploded shells fall into enemy hands. If captured, the entire project risked exposure. But the Germans never managed to duplicate it. By the time they realized what the Americans had achieved, it was too late. Their research into similar technology, under severe bombing and resource shortages, never advanced beyond prototype. The result was a permanent shift in battlefield psychology. The Germans had once prided themselves on precision. Now that word belonged to the Americans. They weren't just firing shells. They were programming destruction. Every battlefield has two kinds of power, the physical and the mental. The Americans now possessed both. And while the technology made their artillery unmatched, the human discipline behind it gave it soul. Precision didn't come from machines alone. It came from men, young, sleepless, mud-covered soldiers who worked in rhythm with steel. An American artillery battery in Europe was a world of constant motion. Powder bags stacked shoulder-high, range tables pinned to the walls of command trucks, radios hissing with voices of forward observers calling in targets through the snow or fog. Every gun crew had a role. One adjusted elevation, another set the fuse, another rammed the shell, another pulled the lanyard. The pace was relentless. In heavy engagements, a 155mm crew could fire up to 2 rounds per minute, each weighing nearly 100 pounds. Gunners would later describe the heat of the barrels, the shaking ground, and the metallic rhythm that came to define their days. It wasn't chaos, one veteran recalled. It was music. Every man knew his part. They rarely saw the enemy they destroyed. They didn't hear screams or see bodies. What they saw were coordinates. They trusted the system, the math, and the unseen observers miles ahead. When the results came back, target neutralized, excellent fire. It meant their discipline had saved lives somewhere down the line. Artillerymen called it the long arm of the army. The infantry called it the voice of God. And by 1944, no one on the battlefield doubted which voice spoke louder. German officers who faced this new level of firepower were not inexperienced. Many were veterans of Poland, France, and the Eastern Front, men who had lived through bombardments before. Yet none had ever witnessed what American artillery could now do. Reports recovered after the war show clear disbelief. A German divisional log from the Ardennes notes, "Enemy fire arrives without ranging shots. Entire salvos detonate at once. Casualties severe. Morale affected." Another account from a company commander near Elsenborn Ridge described, "Shells bursting above treetops. Invisible aircraft or new ordnance suspected." His men believed the Americans had begun using guided munitions. The shock wasn't just in the destruction, but in its consistency. Every time German units tried to regroup, American fire followed with eerie precision. It struck ammunition dumps, crossroads, even command posts hidden behind ridge lines. No pattern seemed safe. Captured officers later admitted that morale collapsed faster under artillery bombardment than during infantry attacks. The feeling of helplessness, or of being watched and targeted with mathematical certainty, was demoralizing in ways even tank assaults weren't. German gunners tried to respond with counter-battery fire, but it rarely worked. American observation planes and radar systems detected muzzle flashes within seconds. By the time German batteries repositioned, counterfire had already destroyed their old sites. To German field officers, it seemed that the Americans had achieved something impossible: omnipresent awareness and flawless timing. Behind every precise barrage stood a machine far larger than any battlefield: the American industrial engine. Factories in Illinois, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey ran day and night producing 155-meter shells and proximity fuses. Women filled the assembly lines, soldering circuits and checking fuses under magnifying lamps. Each unit was inspected, tested, and sealed with military precision. By 1945, American industry was producing nearly 40,000 proximity fuses per day. Every one of them was a tiny masterpiece of physics, a combination of vacuum tubes, capacitors, and miniature transmitters built to survive artillery launch speeds. German intelligence, desperate to understand how the U.S. maintained such supply, underestimated how deep America's production ran. The United States wasn't just building weapons. It was building systems raw, standardized, interchangeable, reliable. Even under heavy demand, the U.S. supply chain ensured that every artillery division had what it needed. Replacement barrels, new fuses, powder, transport, and everything moved like clockwork. The German war economy, stretched thin by bombing and dwindling resources, couldn't compete. By late 1944, German divisions were rationing shells while the Americans fired with near-limitless supply. Precision wasn't only a matter of aim, it was a matter of abundance. As the battle dragged on, the tide began to shift. The American infantry held the ridges, but it was the artillery that truly blunted the German spearhead. Commanders on both sides understood it. General Hasso von Manteuffel, who led one of the main assault corps, later admitted, "Our advance was stopped not by men, but by their artillery." The U.S. gunners didn't just hold position, they shaped the battlefield itself. They blocked roads, destroyed bridges, and even isolated enemy units by firing fire curtains, dense barrages that cut off movement in and out of key areas. To the Germans, it looked as if the Americans could sense every shift in the front. In truth, it was the combination of rapid-fire coordination, radar-assisted fuses, and perfect communication between ground and air. Artillery batteries would receive a call, compute firing data in seconds, and deliver a strike, often before the Germans even finished setting up their next attack. The sheer speed of American response turned traditional tactics useless. By the end of December, the German advance stalled completely. Their columns lay shattered across snowfields, buried under layers of smoke and ice. The same precision that once existed only on paper, in test ranges, in factories, in engineering diagrams, had now come alive on the battlefield. American artillery wasn't just supporting the infantry anymore. It was leading the war. By late December 1944, the German High Command began to understand that their Ardennes gamble was doomed. What had started as a bold thrust toward Antwerp had become a slow, grinding retreat through snow and mud, and much of the credit, or blame, went to the unseen force above the trees: American artillery. The Luftwaffe couldn't provide cover. The skies were filled with snow, fog, and smoke. Tanks and infantry, General Omar Bradley called it the finest use of artillery in modern warfare. For German commanders, it was the moment they realized the war was no longer winnable. Their tanks could still fight. Their men could still shoot, but they could no longer hide. Every position, every approach, every road had already been measured, plotted, and targeted. The battle that began with surprise and momentum ended with silence. A silence broken only by the echo of distant guns still firing, methodically, as the snow fell. The American precision that started in the laboratories of Aberdeen and the classrooms of Fort Sill had now reshaped the battlefield entirely. And when the smoke finally cleared, Europe's fate was decided not by tanks or bombers, but by the mathematics of American gunnery. When the Battle of the Bulge finally ended in late January 1945, the forests of the Ardennes were unrecognizable. Burned-out panzers lay half-buried in snowdrifts. Frozen soldiers, German and American alike, were scattered along roads and fields, silent witnesses to the most violent artillery duel of the Western Front. The statistics told the story as coldly as the weather. Over 19,000 Americans were killed, but German losses exceeded 100,000, nearly 5 times greater. The majority weren't cut down by small arms fire or tank shells, but by high explosive and proximity-fused artillery. In the official U.S. Army reports, artillery was credited with up to 60% of all German losses in the Ardennes. In some sectors, such as Bastogne and Elsenborn Ridge, that number climbed even higher. German survivors later described how American barrages seemed endless, perfectly timed and terrifyingly accurate. You could not breathe between the explosions, one recalled. The snow shook like thunder under your chest. It was here that the 155mm gun, the M1 Long Tom, became legend. Known for its range, reliability, and deadly precision, it could fire a 95-pound shell over 14 miles. But its power was not just in the weapon, it was in how the Americans used it. Behind every shot was a network of intelligence, radar stations, forward observers, weather data, and precise range tables refined by years of testing. The U.S. Army had turned artillery into a science, and that science turned the tide. What shocked German officers most was not simply the effect, but the scale. The United States. From then on, the pattern never changed. Before every advance came the call for fire. Measured, timed, coordinated. The thunder of the guns wasn't just background noise. It was the language of modern warfare. The Germans by then had no answer. Their production lines were collapsing, their ammunition reserves nearly gone, and their communication networks shattered by constant bombardment. What began as a technical advantage had evolved into total dominance. By the war's final months, the precision and scale of American artillery left even allies astonished. British and Canadian officers wrote of the scientific efficiency of U.S. gunnery, comparing it to an industrial process more than a battlefield act. But for the Germans, it marked a new kind of warfare, one where victory depended less on courage and more on computation. Captured Wehrmacht officers repeatedly spoke of the same fear, the inability to react. One officer from the 26th Volksgrenadier Division later said, "We no longer fought against men. We fought against machines that always knew where we stood." It wasn't entirely wrong. The U.S. Army's use of fire direction centers, aerial reconnaissance, and rapid communication had made artillery a self-correcting weapon system, one that learned and adjusted faster than any human commander. By April 1945, as the Allies entered Germany, the 155mm Long Tom was firing fewer rounds, not because it was needed less,